So, continuing from where I left, sorry, but we've grown out with Niniba while I'm at it. We're looking at episode number 1 of Dark Cybertron cover. And as you can see, it's written by Barber, Roberts, Jimenez, Griffith, Cahill and Perez. Written and drawn. Let's go to this episode synopsis. Okay. John Barber and James Roberts, presumably. Now, how is the sci-fi presented here? These are panels by Guido Guidi. I've carried out your request, Jaxus. For too long I have worked in the shadows, making time to ensure that everything is in its place. Now my true colors shall fly for all to see. Of course we have Dreadwing, whatever, this is nothing. I wanted to give you a concrete example of sci-fi. Okay, but at last, Jaxus, does my Titan arrive? Indeed, one called Waspinator controls the Behemoth's passage across the space bridge. This Waspinator, is he loyal to our cause? Irrelevant. Okay, so here the plotline is, let's say it's long-lasting. It goes back to Spotlight Thundercracker. I'm assuming, I think. Correct me if you're wrong, if I'm wrong, or if... But that's not the point. It's been laid out apparently for a while, so the Titans and this thing was supposed to happen. It had been planned, and in explain, you can see Waspinator on the shoulder of the Titan there, on his left shoulder. But how do they sort of move? They have to move a lot. The plot requires the baddies to bring a lot of these giant thingies to Cybertron. So the way they do that is they've explained, and I think it's, I don't know if this is pre-Windblade or post-Wind. I think it's post-Windblade. So we already have a precedent of a city speaker. A city speaker is because Titans are also city bots, or what's the word? But you get me. And there are supposed to be robots that have an ability to sort of speak with these things, because the explanation is that they are very big. Now again, this explanation comes from More Than Meets the Eye, in an episode where they find a thumb, and they I don't know if it's a prequel to we can see it, I think, in this. Let's go back. These panels here are from an episode on the More Than Meets the Eye series, either in a prequel to Dark Cybertron or anyway in the preparation for it. I think maybe it's not this episode. Anyway, at the end of this line, spoilers ahead, they end up finding a Titan and having to communicate with it. And among the things that get revealed there is that, for example, the Titan wouldn't know it's dead for a long time before it actually has lost vital functions, because it's so big that information would take a lot of time to travel from one point to another, as in also kilometers and kilometers and so on. So everything it does is sort of also diluted and in time, not only in distance, which is a very interesting concept, because it explores sci-fi with syntax, I suppose, in vocabulary anyways. But going back to otherwise how science is presented in Dark Cybertron, it's not particularly revealing, as this panel, for example, reveals. It's just a reality that we're told. It's been laid across during the watched previous episodes, and in some of them these things have been explained, in others they haven't. And we're just told it's happening like this. So Waspinator is controlling the Behemoth passage across the space bridge. How does the space bridge work? Why does Waspinator control the Behemoth, and so on? We're supposed to know from previous episodes. And yet, because this was also supposed to be a soft reboot when they did it, and I think there was an intent from Hasbro pushing towards this so that they could bring in a new audience, was to not burden it too much with the pre-story required. So, and this was particularly true in regards to Phase 1, which we can sort of say that ends with chaos, but is less true for Phase 2. So they just wanted to sort of give less reading to have to do, because Phase 1 was quite not impressive, but it was there's a lot of reading and buying to do if you wanted to read it. So they wanted to give a chance to people to jump on, and they had sort of done this already with More Than Meets the Eye and Rid, but they did it again after Season 2, I suppose. That was more or less after 2 years, or 1. Regardless, the point is that to make there is an explanation to these things, as I've told you. Waspinator is supposed to have some city-speaking abilities, presumably. Probably explain it more further on. It's not as if he's presented further on in the storyline in the IDW verse as a city speaker, but presumably he has this skill here. And I think in the Thundercracker episode it sort of goes into depth into explaining that. And there's, I think, also More Than Meets the Eye that explains the space bridge functionality, that the Titans have a space bridge built inside them. And this is a recurring factor that also pops up in Machinima Transformers and is just sort of presented like a truth. And if it's laid like this, it doesn't seem like a sci-fi explanation, but when it needed an explanation, I hope you get what I mean. So traditionally, since it's sort of Rid has tried to encumber itself less with baggage, to be more, at first, easy going, available, sort of for a new public that wasn't savvy of all the pre-lore and stuff. But as, I suppose, Hasbro stepped in, trying to sell toys, and there were spotlights that were being the comics sold with, they weren't the spotlights, but regardless, there were comics being sold with the toys. So this era, sort of, which is closer with the Combiner Wars and Dark Cybertron moments, and it's where the narrative was pushed towards a more, I suppose, toy-friendly audience, which basically means a younger audience. So whether it was pressure from Hasbro or basically Rid continuing its trajectory, it kept simplifying and reducing elements to accommodate these other, let's call them, necessities. And the result on the sci-fi, on the explanation of how things happen, why they happen, is that they're just presented like a fact. And sometimes that sort of, in sci-fi, doesn't work, and I don't know if anybody wants to argue that Transformers isn't sci-fi, but at the very least it sort of has some elements of it. So it's going to require some sort of interpretation of how you want to see this reality. Now, of course, the master of sci-fi is obviously Ridley Scott, where you have to go in hibernation and there's no hyperspace or light travel. But a lot of these things are given in the Transformer universe, and it is a true fact that, or it is a true fact, I suppose, it's kind of established that things that have been established during a lore, let's say a run, are kept within the story. So if somebody is, and the problem here is that since we have phase 1, 2 and such a long-standing continuity, everything that has happened in continuity from a science perspective is supposed to be part of the continuity, so it doesn't require any further explanation when it happens again. So if you've explained space bridges, well, you've explained space bridges. And if you don't, you're just going to have to go on Wikipedia, and I don't know if you haven't read it that far. But I've always found Raid and eventually Optimus Prime a bit frustrating from this point of view. Which is also a pity for this particular story arc, because having chosen Shockwave for the main villain and retconning the retconning the plot to previous periods, for example to Maximum Dinobots and Spotlight Shockwave and Spotlight Soundwave. The lore is referring automatically to the the Furman era. So things that have been established in that era are supposed to be accepted in phase 2. But as I've said, Barber and that part of the series was also aiming at having a wider target audience, or a younger target audience, so relieving pressure from the plot in terms of science fiction and continuity knowledge that is required for understanding the reading. And the result, and I think it's a pity, because the first season of Rid was more interesting than it then revealed to be in its lifetime. So Barber, unfortunately, I don't have anything against Barber. I think he's also he's very into world building, and having to have either his own comic or having to direct and manage or foresee all the other comics, sort of in this structure of the writer's room, has damaged his product, as the fact that he wanted, or that IDW saw his product as the window for a wider target audience, has almost tragically sort of affected his writing in the eras, starting from Dark Cybertron. And while it seemed like an opportunity for him to grow as a writer, in the first tie-in with More Than Meets the Eye, this one, Dark Cybertron, all the subsequent tie-ins were lacking and sort of felt like I don't want to be negative towards his product, but the fact was that they at least interfered with what Roberts was doing with his work, and felt unnecessary when reading that. So a lot of people fell out of love of Barber's writing, and this was also due to what IDW and then eventually Hasbro wanted from IDW Transformers, let's say. But going back to how Roberts presented his sci-fi, it was very much holistic in his way of dealing with the narrative, which was like to give you a whole series of punchlines with which the complicated and boring stuff was delivered, which made it a lot more interesting. And we had a series of characters that were delivering constantly you knew that sort of Brainstorm and Perceptor were explaining the science part, and Rodimus was making it easy, and Ultra Magnus was sort of being the law sturdy and thick-headed guy, and Swerve being the sort of the guy who likes getting around the rules. And so every time one of these issues was being presented, it could be presented through the filters, through these what's the word? Not presenters, but storytellers. It was a different filter through which you could see the story, and it made it more understandable, more empathic through the eyes of the narrator directly. So Swerve's point of view rather than even Red Alert's point of view, blah blah blah. And in all this, like I could pick up on a discussion I was having on the forums, which was about franchises that had been included into the lore. Now I see, and Phase 1 is not so big on including other Transformer verses into the lore, but and I think there's a distinct period when this starts happening a lot more, which is when Nick Roche and Barbers start writing for Lost End of the Records, and it's sort of expanded upon in More Than Meets the Eye, which is that to try and bring other characters from different established mythoses of Transformer into the IDW verse, which namely was Beast Wars, but also a lot of unknown characters from the different either Japanese continuities or cartoons. And you can see an example of this in, for example, the episode where Tarn and Deathsaurus meet, where a lot of the characters and cast from other unknown cartoons of the franchise are brought into this verse, as well as Sins of the Wreckers is very Beast Wars heavy, and there are also a series of other cameos of franchises that have been bought by Hasbro but that are tricky, let's say. So GoBots and Rock Lords, which are the same franchise in the end, have both featured or cameoed at some point in the IDW verse, one in Megatron Origin and the other in More Than Meets the Eye, episode number 1. And I think there are other cameos of other satellite properties. But this was a way of expanding the universe that Roberts was influencing in a positive way how the IDW verse. And a big part of the game, or what people were doing or enjoyed doing when reading More Than Meets the Eye on the forums, was to recognize and name all the unknown characters in the panels, you know, in the backgrounds. And it turned out that there wasn't one genericon in the panels, that Milne and Roberts had sort of coordinated, and each Transformer there was from some continuity. So we had these, and in particular I'm talking about More Than Meets the Eye episodes on the functionist past of Cybertron, and those were very interesting because they also from a visual point of view, and a lot of that influence, and this is documented in interviews with Roberts, were produced from sort of cooperation between the writer and the artist, sorry, in including characters, these characters into the franchise, and this was sort of the legacy of Roche and Roberts, and one of the elements that was most enjoyed by the fandom, in my opinion. A plus side was Roberts' way of writing. and we can sort of notice the differences between Roberts and Nick Roche in the more grimdark elements of the story, but on the other hand, Last Stand of the Wreckers is a lot less sci-fi heavy. It's just much more action compared to More Than Meets the Eye, which is a lot more sci-fi and comedy and a whole series of and tragedy and a whole series of other things. But I think that those are the two elements that distinguish Roche and Roberts, which are the defining elements of Phase 2, whether you like it or not. I mean, Barber is present previously, and he sort of keeps he's a connection with that continuity, but he never really brings anything fresh from not the narrative, from the storytelling point of view, let's say, or even the visual point of view. Sometimes he would pick up on what the others were doing, and that came sort of well, but it wasn't as well delivered as those who were doing it directly. I still recall reading some of those panels from More Than Meets the Eye of the Functionist universe, and spending a lot of time looking at those panels, trying to recognize some of those characters. And I'm not particularly lore informed on all the Japanese verses or cartoon continuities like Victorian Zone and so on. But it was interesting, it was fresh, it was good to see other characters, and it was fun and properly done how they were included in the lore. An example of how this went wrong eventually later is the colonies. So post Camino we had an inclusion of all these colonies in this sort of Council of Cybertron, in which Earth is included, which brings back to Cybertron a whole lot of new Transformers, which is sort of in the direction we were talking about, in which Roberts and Roche had done Last Stand of the Wreckers and More Than Meets the Eye. And yet, none of these characters, though, had character development, and they were, while I don't know, at some point Roche and Roberts were still doing some cameos that didn't have character depth, but at the same time they would sort of flesh in a lot of unknown characters in the lore. For example, Whirl, Starsaber, and what he did with Cyclonus, I enjoyed a lot. Or even Tailgate, which was G1 cast anyways, but had never had a lot of space, either comic or cartoon. So, not to mention Skids. It just feels like Robots in Disguise picked up on what More Than Meets the Eye was doing, and this all came together in Dark Cybertron, and just took it the bankers' way, and you know, the moneymakers' way, and ever since it hasn't been the same, and it hasn't been as enjoyable. And this, unfortunately, is partially true for More Than Meets the Eye or Lost Light as well. So not only did Rid or Optimus Prime, or whatever you want to call it, lose a lot of quality after Dark Cybertron, and then after Combiner Wars, and then after Titan Wars, but so did sort of More Than Meets the Eye, because it was being backtracked and spinned away from its own narrative, and it just made things feel more complicated and sort of wrong, and you were just waiting for the whole thing to finish and go back to the narrative where it had been left, which was, I think, a way a lot of fans were feeling. I mean, if you, considering what was being done with Rid, which was to dumb it down in the end for a younger target audience, which is fine if you had two series. One, you can sort of target it for younger and stuff like that. But since Last Stand of the Records was one of the products that brought back a lot of older people to this nostalgia thing, people who weren't interested anymore in Transformers or weren't even looking at them, it sort of gave a lot of new air to the fandom. And I'm not talking the franchise, I'm talking about the fandom, the G1 appreciators, let's just call them, the Bay haters. I'm one. Anyways, it just sort of made everything a lot less interesting. So, and when Barbara unfortunately was part of that bandwagon, and that's it, I suppose. Let's leave it with Dominus Ambus and Rang having their moment.